on this day, not tomorrow, not yesterday, this day, November 11th. That's 1/1/11/2023. I'm going to read my wedding list. Now, I know I was married at the Ramada at the corner of, must be 202 and Route 1, probably. Father of the bride says to me, "You're only getting $8K for your wedding." So it was basically right around now where I was planning the ring trick where I proposed. She accepted with full gratitude right near Constitution Avenue. Did everything properly except when the carriage arrived. I think I did one thing small the wrong way. I get back in. Ladies driving one of those horses carriages around, one quick ride for $1 or however much it costs. She says to me, "Oh man, I'm explaining to the driver with the horse. We just got engaged." So she's like happy with the horse driving around. My wife's sitting there. Of course, 6 months later, we're married on June 5th, 1992. I'm gonna read the wedding list and what they gave me. Don't forget, she deserted me for another man. Were you deeply affected by that? Oh yeah. See, you need son to read. Who do you think made this list? Well, obviously, it's my handwriting. Now, if you're the mother of the bride, right? So they usually get the most guests. Look at that, all that white paper. So my parents, they couldn't take the pictures because they had to get somebody else to take them. And he blew it. I mean, he definitely took all the most horrible pictures. So the mother of the bride was just furious. She's looking at the pictures saying, "Oh." So, of course, I rented my old tux gown because my wife still had a wedding gown. Because she definitely gave it back, but she didn't keep it that long. So I had to re-rent the tux, go back to my parents' house, pick them up, get it all in the car together. 4 of us going, I think it was Longwood Gardens, because my father would do all the best picture taking places. Of course, my mother, with the elegance, with the bridegroom thing, with the gown, the whole thing, proms, everything. And she bit the dust at 82, but she knew she was gone. Father passed away, must have been August 19th, right near his birthday, basically. He passed away sometime. He's definitely top on the list. It says Mr. and Mrs. Juliana, Joe and Jones, 715 Windsor Circle, Falkirk, Pennsylvania, 19032. $1,000 cash shower gift. Wedding number 2. Here goes Dr. and Mrs. Joseph Juliana. Of course, that was their old address, and that's their new address. I can tell that. 5 guests. Wedding number. Okay, that's what that number means. Okay. Here's Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Brown. Dennis and Mary Jones. That's her old address. She moved. Here's Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Young. Tommy and Susan. That's still their address. How much they give? Yep, normal. So most of them were 100, 150. Had 25 in there. I wouldn't know who they are. Some of the names are not here anymore, but there's all their addresses. Who are we up to? Mr. and Mrs. John Iuliano. Yeah, that was a previous one from him. Oh, he's way out of that house. Here's my grandmother, Mrs. Consolata Iuliano, 1305 Tasker Street, Philadelphia, PA. 19148, $50 from her. Mr. and Mrs. Frankenbrogno, Frank and Carol. Yeah, they lived probably there. $30. Mr. and Mrs. Guido Iuliano, 1908 South 12th Street, Philadelphia, PA. 19148, $50 cash. Miss is Christine Iuliano. She flew back, or she definitely around. Miss Gina Iuliano, same as above. Ooh, that's a tough one. Mr. and Mrs. Robert McCooch, Robin Donald. Vincenttown, New Jersey. I wouldn't know that. Some of these are not mine, but I know which ones are my mother's guests, of course. Because Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Nichols, Holmes, PA. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Imbrogno, that would be the son and daughter. Or, yeah, that would be, he's just my cousin, basically. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Picho. That's Wilmington for you. Mr. and Mrs. Salvatore Giuliano. He didn't give anything? He knows we not a guitar player. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Murphy. Total fox. In the Viking frame. Mr. and Mrs. Frank Sinatra. Frank and Diane. That's probably their dress. They know who they are. Mrs. Catherine Sinatra. Same as above. Mr. Frank Sinatra. Same as above. Mr. Robert Sinatra. Priest. Same as above. Mr. Lou Sinatra and guests. Rich man. Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Sinatra and Mr. Doug something. I know they got divorced, had kids. Mrs. Jennifer Sinatra, total fox, showed up the wedding same day. Her and my ex-wife were at somebody else's wedding. They both had the same dress on. Of course, my brother-in-law, he nailed it. He was laying into the top, of course. There's Mr. and Mrs. John Burns, right there, right basically across from St. Pius and Broomall. Miss Deborah Burns, because she defied her own father, he passed off. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Short, Mike and Maggie. 27 Windsor Drive. That looks confusing. Anybody give big cash? Who are we on? There's Andrew Short, Kathleen Short, Annie Woodback, and Shane. A last minute sign on. Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Snowden, Vincent Ellie, Mr. and Mrs. Kevin Flynn, Kevin and Denise. Phone number written down. Mr. and Mrs. Brian Flynn, Brian and Ellen. Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Flynn, Ronnie and Suzanne. Miss Patricia Flynn. Sister Maria Patricia. Sisters of, they had a nun there. Okay, I wouldn't have known her. Now it says McCormick next. That's Mr. and Mrs. Edward McCormack. Media PA. Mr. and Mr. Mark McCormick and Mark and Kathleen Ives. Mr. and Mrs. William Kinnett, Bill and Elizabeth. Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Kessler, Ken and Rosalind. Mr. and Mrs. Patrick McHugh. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Keenan, Dan McKean, sorry. Mr. and Mrs. James Moyer. Mrs. William Broadbelt and Isabella. Miss Jenny Newtons. Mr. and Mrs. Elwell German, Elwell and Cookie, Prospect Park, 714 17th Avenue. Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Burns, London, Northwest something, England, 010, that's probably. There's 0 on that one. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Burns, well, Kilburn, that's 35 over there. Miss Matilda Burns, Paddington, London, $50. Mr. and Mrs. Frederick McCormick, Uddington, Glasgow, Scotland. Mr. and Mrs. Arthur McCord, Homebridge, Uddington, Glasgow, Scotland. Mrs. Francis Kelly, 6 Denby Street, Uddington, well, that's Glasgow. Because there's their state of Scotland. I guess they didn't show up. Wedding number, well, that's the end of that page. Now, who's most important in your life? Well, here's a manila envelope. Who's most important in your life? Let's see. Who is it? Okay. So the name Ed, and believe me, we didn't make games off of Fallcroft all the time. Especially it's called Kick the Can. I don't think they know how to play it, but it's called Kick the Can, not Kick the Can down the street like politicians do, because they're made to do that. But when you're late, like it's 9 o'clock, and you know you have to go in, and you have all these kids, elementary school age, say 1, 2, 3, I see somebody or other running towards the can to kick it. So if they kick the can before you announce their name, you kick the can, and then you're still it, and everybody runs around and hides. So everybody who's hiding can run way far away and never find it. It's called Kick the Can. So it's 1, 2, 3, I see. Next page. There's my aunt. And believe me, my sister, I went specifically to her house with the a wedding video. Right? And so I have to look good, believe me, at any age. Because could get caught in the window. Because there's my aunt, and I have her social security number right there. But the thing is, you don't know if they recycle social security number, right? What happened to her husband? Well, obviously, her name isn't Giannotti. She took the name of her husband, Giannotti. Is that how you spell that? Giannotti. But he said there's Bittner, Dixie. I mean, there's Edward Dixie. These are all common names. There's Norwood. Oh. So he gave. No, that was my aunt. She probably gave. No. Oh, she gave me a bond. Okay, that's where the bonds came from. Okay, here's Lennox. So, yeah, there was this. That's my aunt. She gave Lennox. And that was my other. I guess the other one's gone by then. Yeah, because these are all. I know some of them are dead, basically. Okay. So here's my aunt. You think she cares if I read her name? I got her social security right now. I have my wife's birth certificate, social security number probably still in there. How many pages left in this list? Oh, that's a lot of names. Well, here's my soccer list. Well, I'm going to that one next. Because there's all these people who are my friends. How many of your friends have made the list yet? I know I only had like 1 or 2 tables of just my friends, like my boss at the time, but he wasn't the top boss. His name was Mark Wharton. And believe me, he was a smart guy, man. He was a smart guy, basically. He has me on travel, right? It's me and him in London. That's Jacqueline London or just London? And believe me, this is the way this house was supposed to be made. Because right below us, on that side of this house, which is huge, real huge house, he must have picked the whole thing, right? So it's husband and wife, but I'm not the husband or the wife in this house, basically. Somebody else was. He had an actual wine light switch holder, like light switch. These were the original ones because they're just gray. But some kid lived through this house, obviously. But he old now. He came with the house basically. He is an old person. He's over 30, basically. But huge arms, muscles. Because he knows that I'll put this up. And he knows how to read. So there's Mrs. Mildred Giannotti. Her husband. So she basically survived her husband because he passed away at age 65, right on the thing. He had a huge line at his funeral, believe me. He used to walk me around over the wheeler end, right on basically Gray's. That's the corner of Gray's and because they were at 6213 Gray's Avenue across from Lady Loretto. My Aunt Frances used to just sit there every day because she had polio with the braces and everything. And I slept with her when I was a kid too. But I was because she was yeah, I was young basically. And she did. And they only had one bathroom. One. That was Philadelphia House, 6213 Gray's Avenue. It was always dangerous when I walked down that street. What do you think she would want me to do? Oh, she went into the ground probably. I was probably at her funeral. Oh, and you don't think you're getting married today? You better think twice putting on that ring. Because this is real paper from the past. How much do you think I did it for? Why would it matter to you? Mrs. Mildred Giannotti, 6213 Grays Avenue, Philadelphia, 19142. That's Grays Avenue. Mrs. Rita Bittner, 30 11th Avenue, Haddon Heights, New Jersey. I thought she lived right on 130, but that's pretty close. Here's Mrs. Mary Dixie, 2620 Cambria Street, Philadelphia, PA. Father Edward Dixie, OSA, or Mother of Consolation Church, but he moved on because he had been a priest at many. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Dixie, Bob and Helene. Now you're getting a little too close because you can't see. Yeah, Robert Dixie, Bob and Helene. Yeah, because I was at actually my brother-in-law's funeral. This beautiful girl walked up to me, started talking to me. I'm like, wow, I'm getting lucky. But I didn't know it was a funeral at one of those churches. She puts her arms around me and said, "You don't remember me?" I'm like, what? I thought she was like, she was just, beautiful girl. Said, "Oh, I'm your cousin." I forget, she wouldn't even been in my thing. Right. So she's the daughter of Bob and Helene. Yeah, they lived in Malvern, but it's way up on Route 100. Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Tyler Gross of Sam 360 Watkins Street, Philadelphia. Mrs. Blanche Verna N. Guest, Delmore Drive, 2125, right on the corner, right next to you. Because she had a daughter as well, but they welcomed me in their house all the time, of course. Because right below it, it was first it was a dentist office, then it was a podiatrist office. And there was my neighbor, Mr. and Mrs. Nicholas Spadea, Nick and Pat, 717 Windsor Circle, Fallcroft, PA, 19032, $50. Mr. and Mrs. Ted Caratuno, 731 Windsor Circle, Fallcroft. These are all my mother's friends. Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Delavecco, Tony, and Jackie, and they were the original ticket masters in Fallcroft. 743 Windsor Circle, Fallcroft. Now, he actually built an actual plane in his garage. he was good too. Haircut, basically. Here comes Morgan Madursky, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Madursky, Joe and Marianne, because I knew they moved. They were wild. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Cutcherfellow, 308 Megan Place, Norwood, PA, 19074, $50 cash. So that's my aunt, Uncle Joe, and Aunt Cass, but she's gone. So my Uncle Joe is still around because one of the Cutcherfellows found me on Facebook. I've chatted with her because now I know it's Megan Place right over there in Norwood. Thirsty Jackalis, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Jackalis, another car club because I knew they moved to Prospect Park. 19076, $25, single person. There's Mr. and Mrs. Pat Vivian, 748 Grant Road, Fallcroft, PA, 19032, $100. But they had a horrible tragedy. He was the mayor of Fallcroft. Yeah. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Johnson, 1119 Taylor Drive, Fallcroft, PA, 19032. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Franchino, Tom and Eileen, 850 Taylor Drive, Fallcroft, PA. Tommy, man, he was first team cap. Yeah, first team cap. Free ride to Westchester, basically. Probably. Got hit by a CSX train. I'm pretty sure that was him. Oh, yeah. Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Kadamo, Sharp Avenue, Glen Olden. I wouldn't know that. Mr. and Mrs. John Young. These are not in any particular order. John and Dot, because they lived at Tennessee Avenue, Village, New Jersey, because they moved on from Fallcroft. Yeah, they lived right behind the, basically, Dairy Queen. Right across from Sumner. That's Tennessee Avenue. Mrs. Dora Moore, which is the same as Bob. Yes, that's her. Here's my friend, his dad, he was the best man. Mr. Timothy, well, there's Karen and Mike. Darren and Beth Olson, they give me a picture, they gave us a picture and glasses. She was funny. She was also, she had a secret clearance. She was another beauty, but she didn't ride the submarine. That's Darren and Beth. Oh, yeah, she was cute. She, like, giving a 30th birthday party for my wife. She walks through a screen door. She couldn't see the actual screen. You know, what those French doors, but it had a slider thing. But she literally was having so much fun. She walked straight through it, but she didn't even get hurt. That's Beth Olson for you.
Mrs. Carolyn Desmond, same as above, because they lived on South 2nd Street. Okay, they lived South 2nd. 838 South 2nd Street. I thought it was Queens, but that definitely kind of like Queensville. It's similar. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bagunis, Chester, PA. That's Chuck and Lois. Mr. and Mrs. John Rickle or something. John and Marianne. Mr. Frankhurst Marshall and guest Frank and Donna, because I know Frank just passed away. I guess he did live over there. Because he had, many girlfriends. Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Donahue, Jeff and Meg. Sharmont Falkroff. Meg knows who I am, because I had to pick someone. Because he knows he would go. Mr. John Burns and guest, John and Melissa Johnson. I know he might be gone. Norwood, PA, 19074. Mr. Daniel Ellis and guest, N. He had a top secret clearance. That's Daniel Ellis. Edmonston Road, Rockville, Maryland, 20851. I just heard floor crack. That's Daniel Ellis and guest. Here's Mr. William McAuliffe and guest. Phil and Joni, best friends of mine. Prince William Court, Frederick. He was good. Here's Mr. and Mrs. Mark Ward, 2915 Parker Avenue, Wheaton, Maryland, 20902. He's good dude. He's smart. Here's Kristen Hellman. This is my friends list. Where are we on? Where are we on this list? Well, here's all my soccer list team roster. We're on Cordera and Hellman. She was a smart one. She wanted me, partially. She'd sit across me and say, "Oh, man, Mike, man, come on, man." I'm like, nah, I'm already taken. This was before I was even married. And she did. She felt she was single, but she knew she was cute. Ballerina type. She's probably on that list right there. Oh, because these are all their addresses. Okay, so this is definitely, because here's all the people who, this was the team roster, which was co-ed. So it's Georgetown, Columbia. Yeah, these are all local, basically Washington. Where's Kristen Helmet? Garfield, Bethesda, Maryland. Ceramic Fruit Bowl, which I kept for years. Ceramic Fruit Bowl. That's Hellman. Cordera, which he was even worse, but it's funny as hell. He just liked to ride somewhere. Here's Mrs. Katie Mangione and Stephen Assenbrook, Centerville, VA. That would have been her game. 22020, $30 cash. Neil Clapton or other, Stafford, VA. Now you know where the triangle is. Dave Wilson, Cove Landing Road, Burke, VA. These are all her friends. Mr. and Mrs. Tim Mai, Route 1 PO Box, Gainesville, VA. That would be all her. These are all hers. Mr. and Mrs. John Overcash, Centerville, Virginia. Mr. and Mrs. John Newquist, P.O. Box, The Plain, VA. Mr. and Mrs. Carpenter, Braddock Ridge, Centerville. Kenneth Wagner, Dover Lane, Falls Church, apartment number 201. Mr. and Mrs. William Augustine, Charlotte, North Carolina. Mrs. Teresa Gallo. Right, she was in the wedding party. Bridesmaid 19076. Mr. and Mrs. Sean Sacco. Care of Safari World High Dive Show, 99 Ramindra, Minbury, Bangkok, Thailand, 10510. That's Sean for you. Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Egan, Central Paoli, PA. Mr. James McCartney, Norwood, PA, 522 Essex Road, 19074. Now, we did save people. He was good, but he wasn't He definitely got full scholarship to Monmouth. He was worth it. He won the 500, which his stroke was horrible. He definitely won. Darren Beth Olson, Steamboat Way, Mount Airy, Maryland, 21171. Picture in glasses. Which one's last? 25 minutes to pick the last three. Next one. Well, there's my best man, Timothy Purvis. Don't forget Ingrid Johnson betrayed him. Yeah, because I caught Ingrid and put up his obituary. I said, "You not honoring?" I said, and then she deleted me off Facebook. So she's doing, Ingrid Johnson with a bathing suit. Look her up on Facebook. She's in her 50s or almost 60. Here's Davis. Here's my list. Let's see where mine is. Yep. And yep, total of 189. How many shows? I see 50, 75, 50, 60, 40, 50, 75. How much is that column add up to? 5,200 something. So when you put a down payment on a house, where do you start? Well, if you're born into a rich person's family, where do you start? Well, it's got to start somewhere, right? But how many names did I just read? That's 26 minutes. And follow along, keep reading. There's Mr. and Mrs. Frank Davis. I need better lighting. C. Kane, PA. Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Halfin, 715 Foxcross Drive, Cinnaminson, New Jersey, 08877, $75 cash. That's Ralph and Sue. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Tambin in Rocco, who doesn't even want me, is 216 Jackson Street, Lansdowne. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Donovan, of course, Gina went the wrong way, 796 Taylor Drive, Falkroft. That's Eddie for you. Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Hay, Gramercy Lane, Clifton Heights, PA. That's a big hill for them. Because he ended up gay, basically. Either was gay or he was something. But he lied to his best friend. He told him he had leukemia, but he really had whatever he had. But he definitely showed up at Tim's wedding and funeral. Because Tim, my best man, in my wedding, isn't here. He passed away in 2009, basically. He won MACs, everything. Mac, St. James, all Catholic. I almost made all Catholic. I made varsity. That's a tough thing to do. There's Kevin O'Hara, just lost his whole family, Mr. and Mrs. 402 Grays Avenue, Glen Olin. That's a tough place, man. She lived right there. Mr. and Mrs. Mark Cochran, Henry Drive, Royersville, PA. Miss Lisa Prettyman and guest, Lisa and Robert. Now, that's a particularly bad story because she had stage 4 breast cancer. But she knew she was a fox. I mean, leaving at the funeral, I didn't even know. I knew it was her, but I didn't. She didn't want to tell me what she had because they're all at the funeral together. Kavanaugh's funeral home. Miss Diane White, Highland Terrace, Holmes, PA, 19043. Joan Burt. Mr. and Mrs. James Dever. Now, Jim Dever, his brother got killed at a very young age. Out on Chester Pike. Idiot skitching on the back of a truck, which I know how to do. It's snowing. It's a tough thing to do. He died. Passed away. Basically got crushed. But the mother and father knew they donated a whole sweat thing. So when you get out of the pool, you have to put on your, when you get out of the pool and you're the diver, but all the swimmers are swimming. What do the divers do while the swimmers are swimming? Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Blair, Joey Blair, 1917 Delmore Drive, Falkroft, PA, 19032. That's Joey. Joey and Beth. Kevin Angeletta, I know he's gone. 80 Bunker Hill Street, Charleston, Massachusetts. $0. But here's Mr. Kenneth Hill and guest. Oh no, he was on. Yeah, he was 1155 Taylor Drive. That makes sense. This is Kenneth Hill and guest. Bunker Hill Street, Charles, Massachusetts. Right, old one. Here's Dave Namoli, 723. 725. Sorry. Car phone 19032. Mr. Patrick Lynch. That's my personal friend. 2047 Kent Road. Why do you think they named the different things? Here's Mr. and Mrs. Frank Wilkes, South US 1, Suite Point Sebastian, Florida, $50. Maureen Slater, Whispering Pine Drive, Westchester, PA, 19380. Mr. and Mrs. John Slater, my boss, but he wasn't my boss. 320 Mill Road, Hatboro, PA. So it's got to be another person. And then there's this jockey who was Centrone. Bro, got basically beat the shit out of because he stepped into a Warlock and Pagan fight. Or must have been in the wrong place at the right time, but they definitely beat him up. Then the photographer, $0. So these are all the guests. DJ, 1 seat. Photographer, 1 seat. Video man, 1 seat. Bagpiper, 1 seat. Total, $189. Any more paper? Who needs it? It's 31 minutes of reading names. Did you do that? What's the next name on the list?